Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Facts channel. I'm so glad you found your way here. Maybe you had a long day, or maybe you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to the gentle whisper of flowing water rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. Let your mind relax, your breathing slow, and your body grow light as a leaf floating downstream. Because tonight, we're exploring peaceful rivers, the ancient pathways that have shaped our world with patient, persistent motion. We'll drift from the source springs in hidden mountains to the wide deltas where rivers meet the sea, discovering how water sculpts stone, carries life, and connects everything it touches. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you, or at least spark curiosity as you drift off. Before we begin, if this helps you unwind, consider liking and subscribing. One sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin. The river begins as a spring, water emerging from the earth where underground aquifers meet the surface, bubbling up through rock and soil in a birth that has repeated itself for thousands or millions of years. The temperature of spring water remains remarkably constant throughout the year, typically reflecting the average annual temperature of the region, creating a stable environment where specialized plants and animals thrive. The clarity of spring water is often extraordinary, filtered through layers of rock and sand that remove particles and sediment, leaving water so pure it seems almost unreal. The force with which water emerges varies from gentle seeps that barely dampen the ground to powerful upwellings that create pools several feet deep within moments of surfacing. These springs often become sacred sites for human communities who recognize their life-giving properties and the mystery of water appearing from solid ground. The chemical composition of spring water reflects the rocks through which it has traveled, with some springs rich in minerals that color the water or create deposits of travertine and other formations. The ecosystem around a spring develops its own character, with plants and animals specifically adapted to the unique conditions of constant water flow and stable temperature. The sound of a spring is subtle, a quiet burbling or gurgling that speaks of hidden depths and subterranean journeys, water returning to the surface after travels measured in decades or centuries. The spring feeds into a stream, the first visible beginning of the river's journey, though the true source lies far underground, where rainwater from years past slowly percolates through stone. This emergence marks a transition from the hidden realm of groundwater to the visible world of flowing streams, where water begins its journey to the sea. The headwater stream flows narrow and quick, tumbling over rocks and around obstacles, with an energy born of gravity and steep gradients. The width of these initial streams may span only a few feet, small enough to step across yet carrying the beginnings of what will become a mighty river. The water in headwater streams is typically cold, fed by springs and snowmelt that have not yet warmed under the sun's influence. The sound of headwater streams fills mountain valleys, a constant rushing and splashing that drowns out other noises and creates a white noise that soothes the mind. The gradient of these upper streams creates a world of constant motion, with water rarely forming still pools but instead rushing from one cascade to the next. The rocks in the streambed are shaped by this motion, rounded and smoothed by the endless passage of water and the grinding of stones against each other. The substrate of headwater streams typically consists of cobbles and boulders too large to be moved except during floods, creating a stable foundation for aquatic life. The plants along these streams often include mosses and liverworts that cling to rocks in the splash zone, capturing moisture from the spray without being swept away by the current. The insects living in headwater streams have adapted to the high-flow environment, with many developing streamlined bodies and hooks or suction devices that allow them to resist the current. These small streams join with others, merging at confluences that add their flows together, each tributary contributing its water to the growing river. The chemistry of river water tells the story of the landscape through which it flows, with dissolved minerals, organic compounds, and gases creating a unique signature for each waterway. The pH of river water varies based on geology, with rivers flowing through limestone regions typically being more alkaline, while those draining granite mountains tend toward acidity. The dissolved oxygen content depends on temperature and turbulence, with cold, fast-flowing water holding more oxygen than warm, slow-moving pools. The nutrients in river water, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, determine the productivity of the aquatic ecosystem and influence which plants and algae can grow. The color of river water ranges from crystal clear to tea-stained brown, with the brown tint coming from tannins leached from decaying leaves and woody material. Some rivers run milky white with glacial flour, fine rock particles ground by glaciers and carried in suspension, while others carry red clay that stains the water the color of rust. The electrical conductivity of water indicates the concentration of dissolved ions, with rivers in arid regions often having higher conductivity due to evaporation, concentrating minerals. The temperature of rivers varies with season and location, with water warming as it flows through lowlands and cools when passing through shaded canyons. The taste of river water, though we should not drink it untreated, would reflect this chemistry, with some rivers tasting of minerals and others having a neutral, almost sweet character. These chemical properties create distinct habitats, with certain species able to thrive in soft, acidic waters, while others require hard, alkaline conditions. The velocity of river flow varies dramatically across the length and width of the channel, creating a complex pattern of fast and slow zones that different organisms exploit. The fastest water flows at the surface in the center of the channel, where friction with the riverbed and banks is minimized and gravity pulls most strongly. Along the bottom and near the banks, water moves more slowly, slowed by friction with solid surfaces and by the irregular shape of rocks and vegetation. In bends, the fastest water flows along the outside curve, where the channel is deeper, while the inside of the bend carries slower water and often accumulates sediment. The mathematical description of these velocity patterns involves complex equations, but the simple reality is that rivers contain many different speeds of flow within the same cross-section. Eddies form behind obstacles, creating zones where water actually flows upstream briefly before rejoining the main current, offering resting places for fish and insects. The velocity of water determines what size particles can be transported, with fast water carrying sand and even gravel, while slow water allows fine silt to settle. The seasonal variation in flow means that velocity patterns change throughout the year, with spring floods creating universally fast conditions, while summer low flows reveal the complexity of the slow zones. The plants and animals living in rivers position themselves according to these velocity patterns, with some requiring fast flow and others needing slow water to survive. The sound of the river changes with velocity, from the roar of rapids to the whisper of gentle riffles to the near silence of deep pools. This variation in speed creates habitat diversity, allowing many species to coexist by occupying different velocity niches within the same river. The meander is a river's signature movement, the tendency of flowing water to curve and loop across its floodplain in patterns that repeat at every scale. The physics behind meandering involves the way water flows faster on the outside of bends, eroding the bank, while slower water on the inside deposits sediment, causing the bend to migrate slowly across the landscape. Over time, meanders grow more pronounced, with the loops becoming tighter until eventually the river may cut through the neck of a meander, creating an oxbow lake that marks the former channel. The wavelength of meanders, the distance from one bend to the next, correlates with river width in a mathematical relationship that holds true for rivers on Earth and even appears in channels on Mars. The beauty of meanders from above creates landscapes of nested curves, the river drawing sinuous lines across valleys in patterns that seem almost artistic. The migration of meanders across floodplains creates a mosaic of different aged surfaces, with some areas being recently deposited sandbars while others are older terraces that the river abandoned decades or centuries ago. The plants colonizing these surfaces reflect their age, with young sandbars supporting only grasses and willow seedlings, while older terraces host mature forests. The rate at which meanders migrate varies with river size and flow, with some moving several feet per year while others shift only inches. Indigenous peoples living along meandering rivers understood these patterns, building settlements on high terraces that were safe from the river's wandering. The meander's path across the landscape tells the history of the river, with abandoned channels and oxbow lakes marking its previous positions like a trail of breadcrumbs, showing where the water once flowed. The riffle is a shallow section where water flows quickly over cobbles and gravel, creating the characteristic rippling surface and gentle splashing sounds that epitomize a healthy stream. These areas are typically found where the gradient steepens slightly, or where coarser sediment has accumulated, creating a raised section of streambed. The water in riffles is highly oxygenated due to the turbulent flow that mixes air into the water, making riffles critical habitats for organisms with high oxygen demands. The substrate in riffles consists of particles that are mobile during high flows, but stable during normal conditions, creating a dynamic environment that is periodically reset by floods. The insects living in riffles include mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, whose larvae cling to rocks and graze on algae or filter organic particles from the water. Fish often position themselves just downstream of riffles, where the turbulent water delivers a continuous supply of drifting insects that they can intercept. The depth of water in riffles is shallow enough that light penetrates to the bottom, allowing algae to grow on rock surfaces and form the base of the food web. The spacing of riffles along a river follows predictable patterns, with the distance between riffles being related to channel width in ratios that scientists have documented across hundreds of streams. The sound of riffles is soothing and constant, a white noise that masks other sounds and creates an acoustic environment that many people find deeply relaxing. The riffle pool sequence creates a rhythm to the river's structure, an alternation between fast shallow water and slow deep water that repeats downstream like a heartbeat. The pool is where water slows and deepens, creating zones of calm that contrast with the rushing riffles upstream and downstream. These deeper sections form where the channel has eroded downward, often in bends, or where large obstacles have created scour patterns. The water in pools moves slowly enough that fine sediment can settle, creating soft bottoms of silt or sand, rather than the rocky substrate of riffles. The reduced velocity in pools allows larger fish to rest without fighting the current, making pools critical habitat during migrations when fish need to conserve energy. The temperature in pools can differ from surrounding areas, with deep pools sometimes remaining cooler during summer due to their depth and shade. The stratification of water in pools creates layers, with warmer, less dense water at the surface and cooler water near the bottom, though this layering breaks down in flowing rivers more quickly than in lakes. The organic matter that settles in pools provides food for bottom-dwelling organisms, creating a different community than exists in the faster sections. The low light levels in deep pools limit algae growth, making these sections dependent on organic matter produced elsewhere and carried downstream by the current. The fish living in pools often differ from those in riffles, with some species preferring the slower water and softer substrate that pools provide. The pool's role in the river extends beyond biology, as pools store water during dry periods and help maintain base flow when rain is absent. The stillness of a deep pool, with perhaps just a subtle swirl on the surface revealing the current below, creates moments of calm that punctuate the river's journey. The river's edge is where water meets land, creating an interface zone that shifts with changing water levels and provides critical habitat for countless species. The riparian vegetation along river edges includes trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants adapted to periodic flooding and high soil moisture. The roots of riparian plants stabilize banks, holding soil in place and preventing erosion that would otherwise cause the channel to widen and change shape. The shade provided by overhanging vegetation cools the water, reducing temperatures that might otherwise become stressful for aquatic life during summer. The leaves, branches, and insects that fall from riparian plants into the water provide food for aquatic organisms with some streams receiving most of their energy from this terrestrial input rather than from aquatic photosynthesis. The complex structure of riparian zones creates habitat for birds, mammals, amphibians, and insects, making these areas biodiversity hotspots within the larger landscape. The width of the riparian zone varies with river size and landscape, with narrow strips along small streams expanding to broad corridors along large rivers. The plant species composition changes with distance from the water's edge, creating gradients from water-tolerant willows and alders near the channel to upland species further away. The seasonal changes in riparian vegetation follow the river's own rhythms, with spring growth timed to floods and fall leaf drop providing nutrient inputs when aquatic productivity begins to decline. The edge between water and land is not a sharp line but a transition zone, sometimes submerged, sometimes exposed, always changing and always vital to both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. The sediment carried by rivers shapes landscapes, builds deltas, and provides nutrients that support both aquatic and terrestrial life. The size of sediment particles ranges from dissolved minerals to boulders, with rivers sorting these materials based on the energy available to transport them. Clay and silt, the finest particles, remain suspended in the water column and give some rivers their turbid, muddy appearance. Sand accumulates in areas of moderate flow, creating bars and beaches that shift with each high water event. Gravel and cobbles move during floods, rolling and bouncing along the bed in a process called bedload transport that can be heard as a rumbling or clicking sound when flows are high. The total sediment load of a river can be enormous, with large rivers moving millions of tons of material to the ocean each year. The source of this sediment is erosion in the watershed, with rain, ice, and gravity slowly breaking down mountains and carrying them to the sea. The rate of erosion depends on climate, geology, vegetation, and human activities, with disturbances like logging or construction dramatically increasing sediment inputs. The deposition of sediment creates landforms, with point bars forming on the inside of meanders and levees building up along channel edges during floods. The fertility of river valleys comes largely from deposited sediment, with periodic floods renewing soil nutrients and supporting agriculture for millennia. The journey of a sediment particle from mountaintop to ocean floor may take thousands of years, with the particle being deposited and remobilized countless times along the way. The flood is when the river rises, spreading beyond its normal channel to reclaim the floodplain that is as much a part of the river system as the permanent channel. The frequency and magnitude of floods follow statistical patterns, with small floods occurring often and large floods being rare but devastating when they arrive. The causes of floods vary with climate and watershed, including spring snowmelt, heavy rainfall, rain on snow events, and ice jams that temporarily block flow. The speed with which a river rises during a flood depends on watershed size and characteristics, with small streams responding quickly to rain, while large rivers may take days to crest. The peak of a flood may last only hours, or may persist for weeks, depending on the nature of the precipitation and the storage capacity of the watershed. The water spreading across the floodplain during floods slows down, depositing sediment and nutrients that enrich floodplain soils. The inundation of floodplains provides access to new feeding areas for fish, with many species timing their reproduction to coincide with floods that provide ideal conditions for young fish. The cultural relationship between humans and floods is complex, with ancient civilizations depending on seasonal floods for agriculture, while modern societies attempt to control floods through dams and levees. The ecological importance of floods cannot be overstated, as they reset ecosystems, distribute nutrients, create new habitat, and maintain the dynamic nature of river systems. The recession of floodwaters leaves behind signs of the high water, with rack lines of debris marking the flood's extent and providing evidence that will persist until the next inundation. The base flow is the water that continues flowing even during dry periods, sustained by groundwater seeping into the channel rather than by direct runoff from precipitation. The sources of base flow include springs along the channel, diffuse seepage through the riverbed, and tributary streams that are themselves fed by groundwater. The temperature of baseflow water differs from surface runoff, typically being warmer in winter and cooler in summer due to the moderating effect of the Earth's thermal mass. The chemical composition of baseflow reflects longer contact with soil and rock, often having higher mineral content than surface runoff, which moves quickly across the landscape. The importance of baseflow to aquatic ecosystems is profound, as it maintains habitat during droughts when surface runoff is absent. The duration of baseflow periods varies with climate, lasting only days in humid regions between rain events, but extending for months in arid climates with distinct wet and dry seasons. The relationship between precipitation and baseflow is not immediate, with groundwater inputs lagging weeks or months behind the rain events that recharged aquifers. The human extraction of groundwater for agriculture, industry, and domestic use can reduce baseflow, sometimes causing streams that once flowed year-round to become seasonal. The plants and animals adapted to perennial streams may not survive when baseflow ceases, leading to ecosystem changes and loss of species that require permanent water. The protection of baseflow requires protecting groundwater resources, connecting surface water and groundwater management in ways that recognize their fundamental interconnection. The temperature of river water governs the speed of biological processes, the distribution of species, and the amount of dissolved oxygen water can hold. Cold water, typically defined as below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, holds more oxygen and supports species with high metabolic rates like trout and salmon. Warm water, above 75 degrees, holds less oxygen but allows faster growth rates for species adapted to these conditions like catfish and carp. The daily cycle of temperature in rivers follows air temperature with a lag, with water temperatures being coolest in early morning and warmest in late afternoon. The seasonal cycle shows water temperatures tracking air temperature over longer periods, with rivers in temperate zones warming through summer and cooling through winter. The longitudinal pattern of temperature shows water generally warming as it flows downstream, gaining heat from sunlight and losing the cooling influence of cold springs and snowmelt. The shading provided by riparian vegetation can reduce summer temperatures significantly, with unshaded reaches warming to levels that stress cold water species. The thermal mass of water means that rivers respond more slowly to temperature changes than air does, with water temperatures being less extreme than air temperatures. The influence of dams on river temperature can be dramatic, with water released from deep reservoirs being much colder than natural summer temperatures or, in the case of shallow reservoirs, much warmer. The measurement of river temperature reveals not just the current state, but provides information about climate, land use, and the health of riparian areas. The organisms living in rivers are constrained by temperature, with each species having a range they can tolerate and an optimum where they perform best. The dissolved oxygen in river water is essential for most aquatic life, with concentrations varying based on temperature, turbulence, and biological activity. The source of oxygen in rivers is primarily atmospheric exchange at the water surface, with turbulent flow dramatically increasing the rate of oxygen absorption. Photosynthesis by aquatic plants and algae adds oxygen during daylight hours, sometimes causing supersaturation in highly productive systems. The consumption of oxygen occurs through respiration by all living organisms and through chemical reactions that oxidize organic matter and reduced minerals. The concentration of dissolved oxygen typically shows daily cycles, with minimum levels occurring just before dawn after a night of respiration and maximum levels in mid-afternoon after hours of photosynthesis. The seasonal pattern shows lower oxygen levels in summer when warm water cannot hold as much gas and biological activity is high. The threshold concentration below which fish begin to experience stress is around 3 to 5 milligrams per liter, with different species having different tolerances. The cold water species like trout require higher oxygen levels than warm water species, constraining where they can live based on temperature-oxygen relationships. The rapids and riffles in rivers serve as natural aerators, with the turbulent flow capturing oxygen from the air and distributing it throughout the water column. The destruction of these turbulent sections through channelization or impoundment can reduce oxygen levels and harm aquatic life, even if other conditions remain suitable. The pH of river water, a measure of acidity or alkalinity, influences which species can survive and affects the availability of nutrients and toxicity of metals. The neutral pH of 7 represents a balance between hydrogen and hydroxide ions, with lower numbers indicating acidity and higher numbers indicating alkalinity. Most rivers range from pH 6 to 8, with the exact value depending on the geology of the watershed and the presence of organic acids. Rivers draining limestone regions tend toward alkaline conditions, with pH values sometimes exceeding 8 due to dissolved calcium carbonate. Rivers flowing through coniferous forests often tend toward acidity, with pH values sometimes dropping below 6 due to organic acids from decaying needles. The buffering capacity of water describes its resistance to pH change, with waters high in dissolved minerals being well buffered, while soft waters can experience large pH swings. The biological consequences of pH are complex, with some species preferring acidic conditions, while others require alkaline water, and extremes in either direction being toxic to most organisms. The daily fluctuation in pH occurs in productive systems due to photosynthesis, removing carbon dioxide during the day, causing pH to rise, and respiration adding carbon dioxide at night, causing pH to fall. The seasonal pattern in pH can reflect changing proportions of groundwater and surface runoff, with baseflow conditions often differing in pH from flood conditions. The measurement of pH provides information about watershed processes and can indicate pollution problems, with acid mine drainage or industrial discharges, causing pH values outside the natural range. The nutrients in rivers, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, control biological productivity and determine whether systems are oligotrophic, mesotrophic, or eutrophic. The sources of nutrients include weathering of rocks, decomposition of organic matter, fixation of atmospheric nitrogen by certain bacteria, and increasingly, human inputs from agriculture and wastewater. The concentration of nutrients in pristine rivers is typically low, with productivity limited by nutrient availability rather than by light or temperature. The addition of excess nutrients through pollution causes eutrophication, where productivity increases dramatically, leading to algae blooms and eventual oxygen depletion. The cycling of nutrients in rivers differs from lakes, with the constant downstream flow meaning that nutrients may pass through a river section only once, rather than being recycled repeatedly. The concept of nutrient spiraling describes how nutrients cycle between dissolved and particulate forms as they move downstream, with the length of the spiral indicating ecosystem efficiency. The retention of nutrients in rivers depends on biological uptake, with healthy stream ecosystems capturing and processing nutrients that might otherwise flow directly to the ocean. The seasonal pattern of nutrients shows higher concentrations during periods of runoff when nutrients are washed from the landscape, and lower concentrations during baseflow when biological uptake exceeds inputs. The ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus affects which species dominate the algal community, with some algae groups preferring high nitrogen while others are competitive under phosphorus-rich conditions. The management of nutrient pollution requires addressing sources across the entire watershed, as rivers integrate all the inputs from their drainage area and carry the consequences downstream. The turbidity of river water describes how cloudy it appears, with high turbidity indicating high concentrations of suspended particles that scatter light. The sources of turbidity include erosion from banks and the watershed, resuspension of bottom sediments during high flows, and biological particles like algae and bacteria. The ecological effects of turbidity are complex, with moderate levels being natural and even beneficial by providing food particles and hiding cover, while extreme turbidity can harm organisms by clogging gills, reducing photosynthesis, and interfering with feeding. The measurement of turbidity provides information about erosion rates and land use practices, with sudden increases indicating problems like construction sites or failing roads. The seasonal pattern typically shows higher turbidity during wet seasons, when runoff carries sediment from the landscape, and lower turbidity during dry seasons, when flow is dominated by clear groundwater. The color of turbid water varies from brown to red to gray depending on the mineral composition of the sediment, with iron-rich clays producing red water, while glacial flour creates milky gray water. The settling velocity of particles determines how far downstream they travel before depositing, with fine clays remaining suspended for long distances, while sand settles quickly. The ecological adaptations to turbid conditions include fish that hunt by smell rather than sight, and filter feeders that strain food particles from the water. The reduction of turbidity below dams occurs because reservoirs act as sediment traps, capturing particles and releasing relatively clear water that may be too clear, lacking the natural turbidity that some species depend upon. The sound of the river varies with flow rate, channel shape, and substrate composition, creating an acoustic environment that changes through space and time. The white noise of rapids masks other sounds, creating zones where acoustic communication becomes difficult for animals that rely on sound. The gurgling of riffles produces a pleasant, variable sound that humans find relaxing, with the irregularity preventing the monotony that might come from a pure tone. The silence of deep pools creates spaces where subtle sounds like fish jumping or birds calling become noticeable against the quiet background. The seasonal changes in river sounds reflect changing flows, with spring floods producing roars that can be heard from considerable distances, while summer low flows reduce rivers to whispers. The movement of bedload during floods creates rumbling and clicking sounds as rocks knock against each other, a soundtrack of erosion that signals the river's power. The ice forming on rivers in winter creates groaning and cracking sounds as sheets expand and contract with temperature changes. The animals along rivers contribute their own sounds to the acoustic environment, with frogs, birds, and insects creating choruses that blend with the water's voice. The human connection to river sounds runs deep, with the sound of flowing water appearing in music, meditation recordings, and sleep aids as a universally recognized symbol of peace and continuity. The recording of river sounds captures only part of the experience, as the feeling of the sound includes vibrations felt through the ground, and the context of being present in the landscape rather than listening through speakers. The light penetrating river water determines how deep photosynthesis can occur and influences the behavior of many aquatic organisms. The clarity of the water controls light penetration, with clear water allowing light to reach depths of several feet, while turbid water may stop light within inches of the surface. The color of water affects which wavelengths penetrate, with blue light traveling deepest in clear water, while red light is absorbed quickly, regardless of clarity. The ripples and waves on the surface create patterns of light and shadow on the river bottom, with the caustic patterns formed by surface lenses focusing light into bright spots separated by darker areas. The daily cycle of light follows the sun's path, with morning and evening light coming at low angles that may not penetrate as deeply as midday vertical rays. The seasonal cycle of light reflects both changing sun angles and changing leaf cover, with deciduous forests allowing much more light to reach streams in winter than in summer. The role of riparian shading cannot be overstated, with even narrow buffers of trees dramatically reducing light levels and the resulting algae growth. The adaptations of organisms to light levels include the vertical migration of zooplankton that move deep during day and rise at night to feed, while avoiding visual predators. The perception of light by aquatic organisms extends beyond human vision, with many species detecting ultraviolet or infrared light invisible to us. The romantic image of dappled sunlight filtering through clear water captures something real about the aesthetic appeal of rivers, with the interplay of light and water creating beauty that humans have celebrated across cultures. The ice forming on rivers transforms the landscape, creating surfaces that bridge water and land and change the physical properties of the ecosystem. The formation of ice begins at the surface on calm nights, when water temperature drops to the freezing point and crystals begin to form. The ice crystals growing in turbulent water create fragile ice, loose crystals that float downstream and may accumulate in slow-moving sections or behind obstacles. The anchor ice forming on the river bottom occurs when supercooled water contacts rocks, creating ice that grows upward and can lift cobbles and disturb bottom-dwelling organisms. The ice cover that eventually forms across the river surface insulates the water below, preventing further heat loss and allowing fish and other organisms to survive beneath the ice. The thickness of ice depends on air temperature and duration of cold, with rivers in temperate zones forming only thin ice, while those in Arctic regions may develop ice several feet thick. The breakup of ice in spring can be sudden and dramatic, with warming temperatures and increasing flow lifting ice sheets and carrying them downstream. The ice jams that sometimes form during breakup occur when ice sheets catch on obstacles and pile up, creating temporary dams that can cause flooding when they eventually release. The ecological effects of ice include scouring of stream banks and beds as ice moves, creating disturbances that reset succession and maintain early successional habitat. The formation of orphies, or overflow ice, occurs in some northern rivers when water forced onto the surface of ice freezes in layers, creating massive ice accumulations that may persist into summer. The confluence is where two rivers meet, merging their waters, sediments, and ecosystems into a combined flow that continues downstream. The visual boundary between rivers at a confluence can persist for miles, with different colored waters flowing side by side before finally mixing completely. The chemistry at confluences reflects the mixing of waters with different histories, with one tributary perhaps being acidic while the other is alkaline, or one clear while the other turbid. The temperature difference between converging rivers creates stratification at some confluences, with warmer water floating atop cooler water in layers that only gradually blend. The biological communities from each tributary converge at confluences, creating zones of high species diversity, where organisms from different source areas encounter each other. The hydraulics at confluences are complex, with the meeting waters creating turbulence, eddies, and sometimes standing waves that reveal the energy of the merging flows. The sediment dynamics at confluences include deposition, where velocities decrease, and erosion, where they increase, with the resulting channel morphology reflecting the balance of these processes. The cultural significance of confluences extends across human history, with many cities founded at these strategic locations where rivers enhanced trade and transportation. The ecological productivity of confluences often exceeds that of either tributary alone, with the mixing of waters bringing together nutrients and organisms in combinations that support high biological activity. The sound at a confluence blends the voices of both rivers, creating a chorus that speaks to the power of connection and the way separate streams become unified flows. The mouth of the river is where it reaches its destination, spreading into a delta or estuary as it encounters the lake, sea, or ocean that receives its flow. The delta forms when the river deposits its sediment load faster than waves, and currents can redistribute it, building land outward into the receiving water body. The distributary channels of a delta branch and rebranch, creating networks that look like the veins of a leaf or the branches of a tree, patterns that emerge from the physics of flow and sediment transport. The estuary forms when the river's mouth is drowned by sea level rise or tectonic subsidence, creating a mixing zone where fresh and salt water meet. The tidal influence in estuaries extends upstream for distances that depend on tidal range and river flow, with the boundary between tidal and non-tidal river moving up and down with seasonal changes in discharge. The gradient of salinity in estuaries creates zones where different species can survive, with purely freshwater species upstream, marine species downstream, and specialized brackish water species in the mixing zone. The productivity of deltas and estuaries rivals that of any ecosystem on Earth, with nutrients from the river supporting dense plant growth that feeds fish, birds, and invertebrates. The migration of fish through river mouths connects marine and freshwater ecosystems, with salmon, eels, and many other species moving between these realms at different life stages. The human population density around river mouths reflects the concentration of resources and the advantages for transportation, with many of the world's largest cities located where rivers meet the sea. The transformation of rivers as they reach their mouths, from confined channels to spreading deltas, represents the completion of their journey from mountain springs to ocean vastness. The current in a river creates forces that shape everything living within it, with organisms evolving countless adaptations to maintain position rather than being swept downstream. The streamlined bodies of fish reduce drag, allowing them to swim against flows that would tumble less adapted forms downstream like leaves in a storm. The flattened forms of many aquatic insects press against rocks, minimizing the cross-sectional area exposed to current and using friction to resist displacement. The hooks, claws, and suction cups that bottom-dwelling creatures possess anchor them to substrate, creating physical connections that flow cannot easily break. The silk threads that some caddisfly larvae spin attach them to rocks while allowing their bodies to wave in the current like flags, filtering food from passing water. The behavioral responses to current include positive rheotaxis, where organisms orient upstream and swim just fast enough to maintain position, conserving energy while staying in place. The microhabitats behind rocks and within crevices provide refuges from the strongest currents, creating zones where flow is reduced and smaller organisms can survive. The boundary layer near surfaces, where friction slows water to nearly zero velocity, allows organisms to live within millimeters of rocks, while the water just above rushes past at speeds that would be fatal. The energetic cost of resisting current shapes entire ecosystems, with productivity in fast-flowing sections, depending heavily on upstream inputs rather than local production, because maintaining position consumes energy that could otherwise support growth. The constant downstream push means that organisms must either actively move upstream, have life stages that fly or crawl back upstream, or produce so many offspring that the losses to downstream drift are compensated. The river's flow creates a conveyor belt, constantly moving materials and organisms downstream, requiring continuous upstream movements to maintain populations in headwater areas. The pull-riffle sequence repeats along rivers with remarkable regularity, creating a rhythm to channel structure that reflects fundamental relationships between flow and sediment transport. The spacing between pools or between riffles averages 5 to 7 times the channel width, a relationship that holds across rivers of vastly different sizes. The formation of this pattern emerges from feedbacks between flow, velocity, sediment deposition, and erosion, with slight irregularities in channel shape, becoming amplified into distinct pools and riffles. The pools erode during high flows when velocity increases, and the river's power to transport sediment exceeds the supply, cutting deeper into the bed. The riffles form where sediment accumulates during falling flows, with particles dropping out of suspension as velocity decreases and transport capacity declines. The alternation between scour and fill creates habitat diversity, with each section supporting different communities adapted to its particular conditions. The invertebrate communities in pools differ from those in riffles, with different species exploiting the distinct physical conditions and food resources. The fish move between pools and riffles based on their needs, seeking fast water for feeding and slow water for resting. The migration of the pool-riffle pattern upstream during floods occurs as erosion at pool heads and deposition at riffle tails causes the entire sequence to shift, though the wavelength remains relatively constant. The destruction of pool-riffle sequences through channelization eliminates habitat diversity and reduces the ecological richness of rivers, demonstrating the importance of natural channel complexity. The restoration of degraded rivers often focuses on recreating pool-riffle sequences, recognizing that this fundamental structure supports the biological communities that make rivers productive. The large woody debris in rivers provides crucial habitat, slows water flow, traps sediment, and creates the complex structures that support diverse biological communities. The sources of wood include trees falling from riparian areas, branches dropping during storms, and beaver activity that fells trees and constructs dams. The size of wood that influences channel morphology depends on river size, with small streams being affected by branches, while large rivers require entire trees to create significant structures. The stability of wood in channels increases with size and with how pieces interlock, with single logs being mobile during floods, while log jams may persist for decades. The accumulation of sediment behind wood creates steps in the channel profile, forming pools upstream and downstream that increase habitat complexity. The colonization of wood by aquatic invertebrates provides food for fish, with the boring and shredding activities of insects breaking wood into smaller particles that feed other organisms. The shade provided by leaning trees and by accumulations of debris cools water and creates hiding cover that reduces predation on small fish. The removal of large wood from channels, once common practice in river management, is now recognized as harmful, reducing habitat quality and increasing downstream flooding by eliminating structures that stored water and sediment. The intentional addition of wood to degraded channels has become a common restoration technique, though the engineering of stable wood structures requires understanding of the forces acting on debris during floods. The persistence of wood in rivers varies with wood type, with some species lasting only years while others remain solid for decades, gradually being colonized by mosses, ferns, and even small trees. The gravel bars that form along rivers provide nesting sites for birds, basking areas for turtles, and substrates where willows and other pioneer plants begin the process of revegetation. The formation of gravel bars occurs during falling flood stages, when the river's capacity to transport sediment decreases and particles drop out of suspension or stop rolling along the bed. The location of bars follows predictable patterns, with point bars forming on the inside of meanders, where velocity is lowest, and mid-channel bars forming in straight reaches, where flow diverges around obstacles. The size of particles on bars reflects the energy of the flows that deposited them, with fine gravel indicating relatively weak currents while cobbles require stronger flows. The surface of bars often shows intricate patterns of ripples and grain size sorting, recording the final moments of the flood that created them. The vegetation colonizing gravel bars begins with species that can tolerate shifting substrate and periodic flooding, with willows being particularly successful due to their ability to sprout from broken branches buried in sediment. The succession from bare gravel to dense willow thicket to mature forest can take decades or centuries, depending on the frequency of floods that reset the process by eroding accumulated soil and plants. The nesting birds that use gravel bars, including many species of plovers and terns, depend on the open substrate and isolation from terrestrial predators that bars provide. The seasonal changes in bar exposure follow river stage, with low summer flows exposing extensive gravel areas, while winter floods may submerge all but the highest bars. The mobility of bars means that their locations change over years, with erosion in some places balanced by deposition in others, creating a dynamic mosaic of bare gravel, colonizing vegetation, and mature floodplain forest. The backwater areas where flow slows or reverses provide critical habitat for species that cannot survive in the main current, creating zones of calm in otherwise energetic systems. The formation of backwaters occurs behind obstructions like logs, in side channels that receive flow only during high water, and in alcoves eroded into banks. The water chemistry in backwaters may differ from the main channel due to longer residence time, with temperatures higher in summer and lower in winter, and dissolved oxygen potentially declining if organic matter accumulation is high. The plant growth in backwaters can be luxuriant, with aquatic vegetation finding refuge from scouring flows and establishing beds that provide habitat and food for invertebrates and fish. The fish using backwaters include young individuals seeking refuge from predators and strong currents, allowing survival through vulnerable life stages. The amphibians breeding in backwaters benefit from the absence of fish in some of these habitats, with salamander and frog larvae developing without the predation pressure that exists in connected waters. The seasonal pattern of backwater availability follows river stage, with low flows isolating backwaters and potentially causing them to dry completely, while high flows reconnect them to the main channel. The nutrient dynamics of backwaters include accumulation during isolation and flushing during reconnection, creating pulses of productivity that influence downstream ecosystems. The restoration of degraded rivers increasingly recognizes the importance of off-channel habitats, with projects creating or reconnecting backwaters to provide the habitat diversity that was historically present. The quiet water behind a log or in a side channel, teeming with life invisible from the main river, demonstrates that some of the most productive habitats are not the obvious flowing sections but the hidden backwaters where current slows and allows complexity to develop. The hypoheic zone beneath and beside the river channel represents a hidden realm where surface water and groundwater mix, creating unique conditions that support specialized organisms and important biogeochemical processes. The extent of the hypoheic zone varies with sediment permeability and hydraulic gradient, extending from just beneath the streambed to depths of several feet and lateral distances that may reach hundreds of feet from the channel. The water flowing through the hypoheic zone follows complex paths that depend on pressure differences created by channel topography, with water diving beneath riffles and upwelling in pools. The residence time of water in the hypoheic zone ranges from hours to years, with longer residence allowing more complete processing of nutrients and organic matter. The organisms living in the hypoheic zone, called hypoheos, include specialized invertebrates that are smaller than surface fauna and adapted to living in the spaces between sediment particles. The oxygen that enters the hypoheic zone through downwelling water supports aerobic decomposition of organic matter, though oxygen levels typically decrease with depth as consumption exceeds supply. The nutrients cycling through the hypoheic zone undergo transformations that affect their availability to downstream ecosystems, with nitrogen in particular being removed through denitrification that converts it to gas. The temperature buffering provided by the hypoheic zone helps maintain groundwater-influenced streams at more stable temperatures than surface-only systems would experience. The contamination of groundwater affects the hypoheic zone and thus influences stream ecosystems even when pollutants never directly enter surface water. The recognition of the hypoheic zone's importance has changed how scientists view rivers, expanding the definition beyond the visible channel to include this underground extension that may contain as much water and support as much processing as the surface flow. The ripples forming on sandy river bottoms record the direction and strength of currents, creating patterns that migrate slowly downstream as individual sand grains saltate across the bed. The wavelength of ripples relates to grain size and flow velocity, with finer sand and slower flows producing smaller ripples, while coarser sand and faster flows create larger forms. The three-dimensional structure of ripples provides habitat for burrowing invertebrates and creates hydraulic complexity that influences where particles deposit and erode. The migration rate of ripples can be measured by time-lapse photography, revealing that bedforms move constantly, even when flows appear steady, with each ripple traveling downstream by many times its length over hours or days. The transition from ripples to dunes to plainbed occurs as velocity increases, with each bedform representing an equilibrium between flow energy and sediment characteristics. The preservation of ripples in sedimentary rocks provides geologists with information about ancient river conditions, recording flow directions and velocities from millions of years ago. The sounds produced by moving sediment include the whisper of sand grains colliding and the deeper rumble of gravel rolling, creating an acoustic environment that reveals the river's work, even when visibility is poor. The ecological effects of bedforms include creating spatial patterns in oxygen levels, with the spaces between ripples potentially becoming anoxic, while ripple crests remain well oxygenated. The beauty of ripple patterns, whether viewed from above or felt underfoot, connects observers to the physical processes shaping rivers, making visible the otherwise invisible work of flowing water, moving sand, grain by grain, toward the sea. The color of rivers tells stories about their watersheds, with hues ranging from crystal clear to deep brown to milky turquoise, revealing the rocks, soils, and plants through which the water has traveled. The clear blue of some mountain streams indicates a source in clean springs or snowmelt, with minimal suspended sediment and low organic content allowing light to penetrate and scatter like the atmosphere gives sky its blue. The brown or tea-colored water of rivers flowing through peat bogs or dense forests comes from tannins leached from decomposing vegetation, creating water that is clear when viewed in a glass but appears dark in depth. The milky white of glacial rivers results from rock flour, fine particles ground by glaciers and suspended in water at concentrations that scatter light and give the water an opaque appearance. The red or orange tint of some rivers indicates high iron content, with minerals weathered from rocks and oxidized in contact with air, creating colors that stain everything they touch. The green color appearing during algae blooms indicates high nutrient levels and abundant light, conditions that support rapid photosynthesis and can lead to oxygen depletion when the algae die and decompose. The seasonal changes in river color follow changes in flow and source water, with spring floods often bringing turbid brown water, while summer base flow runs clear and blue. The aesthetic appreciation of river color varies culturally, with some people preferring clear water, while others embrace the beauty of tea-stained flows that reflect the character of forested watersheds. The measurement of river color provides information about water quality and ecosystem function, though the interpretation requires understanding what natural color should be versus what indicates pollution or disturbance. The palette of river colors, from sapphire to amber to jade to rust, creates landscapes of remarkable beauty where water becomes a medium for light and minerals, to paint scenes that change daily with flow and season. The hydraulic jump occurs where fast, shallow water meets slower, deeper water, creating a standing wave or turbulent roller that marks the energy transition. The formation of hydraulic jumps requires specific combinations of upstream velocity and depth, with the jump forming where Froude number decreases below 1, indicating the transition from supercritical to subcritical flow. The energy dissipation at hydraulic jumps is intense, with the turbulent mixing converting kinetic energy to heat and sound at rates that can be measured by the roar and spray produced. The air entrainment at jumps increases dissolved oxygen, making these features important for maintaining water quality in rivers where organic pollution might otherwise cause oxygen depletion. The fish passage through hydraulic jumps can be difficult or impossible depending on jump height, with some species able to jump through while others are blocked by the turbulent conditions. The sediment transport through hydraulic jumps includes both deposition as velocity decreases and erosion in the roller itself, creating complex patterns of scour and fill around these features. The stability of hydraulic jumps varies with flow, with some jumps persisting at the same location across flow stages, while others appear and disappear, or migrate upstream and downstream. The engineered hydraulic jumps below dams serve to dissipate energy and prevent erosion, though their ecological effects include blocking fish migration and creating hazardous conditions for boaters. The natural hydraulic jumps at the base of waterfalls or rapids create distinctive aquatic habitat, with the aerated water and turbulent conditions supporting specialized communities. The beauty of a hydraulic jump, with standing waves and spray catching sunlight in rainbows, demonstrates that even the physics of flowing water can produce scenes of remarkable aesthetic power. The seasonal patterns in rivers follow the rhythms of precipitation and snowmelt, creating annual cycles that organisms have adapted to across millennia. The spring freshet in snowmelt-dominated rivers brings the year's highest flows, scouring channels, moving sediment, and providing fish with access to spawning habitat in side channels and floodplains. The summer low flow period reduces rivers to their minimal extent, concentrating organisms in remaining pools and creating conditions where competition for space and resources intensifies. The fall rains in temperate regions create a second, smaller peak in flow, refreshing pools that may have become warm and stagnant during summer. The winter flows vary with climate, remaining high in rainfall-dominated systems but declining to base flow in regions where precipitation falls as snow and accumulates until spring. The predictability of these seasonal patterns varies geographically, with some rivers showing high year-to-year consistency, while others range from flood to drought with little regularity. The biological adaptations to seasonal flow patterns include timing, reproduction to coincide with favorable flows, entering dormancy during unfavorable periods, and migrating between habitats as conditions change. The cultural traditions of human communities along rivers often reflect these seasonal patterns, with activities scheduled around high water for transportation or low water for fishing. The alteration of seasonal patterns by dams and diversions disrupts the ecological relationships that evolved over millennia, with species adapted to natural flow regimes, sometimes unable to persist under regulated conditions. The restoration of natural flow patterns has become a goal of river management, recognizing that the timing, magnitude, and duration of flows matter as much as the total annual volume. The turning of seasons along a river, from the chaos of spring floods to the languor of summer pools to the transition flows of autumn, creates a temporal structure as important to river ecosystems as the spatial structure of pools and riffles. The braided channel pattern occurs in rivers with high sediment loads and variable flows, creating networks of shallow channels separated by bars that shift constantly with changing water levels. The formation of braided patterns requires steep gradients, high sediment supply, easily eroded banks, and flashy flow regimes that create the conditions for continuous channel instability. The individual channels within braided rivers may be small and shallow even when total flow is substantial, with water spreading across the width of the valley floor rather than concentrating in a single deep channel. The bars separating channels consist of gravel and cobbles that are mobile during floods but stable during low flows, creating substrates that are constantly being reworked. The vegetation colonizing bars in braided rivers faces challenges from frequent disturbance, with only the fastest growing species able to establish before the next flood erases all progress. The fish in braided rivers must deal with constantly changing habitat, with channels that existed yesterday potentially being gone today, and new channels appearing in locations that were dry land. The sediment transport in braided rivers is enormous, with these systems moving more material per unit area than any other river type, carrying the products of rapid erosion from mountains to lowlands. The beauty of braided rivers from above creates patterns like silver threads woven through a tapestry of gravel, with the channels catching light and appearing luminous against darker bars. The ecological productivity of braided rivers is often low due to constant disturbance, though some species have adapted specifically to these dynamic conditions and thrive where other species cannot survive. The preservation of braided rivers has become a conservation priority, as their dynamic nature is often seen as undesirable by humans who prefer stable, predictable channels, leading to channelization that eliminates the natural form. The anastomosing channel pattern creates multiple stable channels separated by vegetated islands, combining elements of braided and meandering rivers in a pattern that remains relatively consistent over time. The formation of anastomosing patterns occurs on gentle gradients with cohesive banks, fine sediment loads, and often in association with vegetation that stabilizes islands and prevents channels from migrating. The channels in anastomosing rivers tend to be deep relative to their width, contrasting with the wide, shallow channels of braided rivers. The islands separating channels support mature vegetation, including forests that may be centuries old, indicating the long-term stability of the pattern. The flow distribution between channels varies with total discharge, with some channels being active only during high flows, while others carry water year-round. The sediment deposition on islands during floods builds them vertically, causing islands to grow higher over time and becoming increasingly isolated from all but the largest floods. The ecological diversity of anastomosing rivers is high, with the variety of channel sizes and island ages creating numerous habitat types within a relatively small area. The nutrient cycling in anastomosing systems involves complex exchanges between channels, islands, and floodplain areas, with organic matter being trapped and processed at multiple points rather than moving rapidly downstream. The human use of anastomosing rivers often involves navigation challenges, with multiple channels complicating boat travel, and the shifting distribution of flow making route finding difficult. The conversion of anastomosing rivers to single-channel systems through levee construction eliminates the habitat diversity and flood storage that makes these systems ecologically valuable. The cross-sectional view of an anastomosing river valley, showing multiple channels at different elevations separated by vegetated islands, reveals a complexity that single-thread rivers cannot match. The sinuosity of a river describes how much it curves relative to a straight path, with values ranging from 1 for perfectly straight channels to values exceeding 4 for extremely tortuous paths. The causes of high sinuosity include low gradient, cohesive banks, and the self-reinforcing nature of meanders, where initial curves create flow patterns that enhance bending. The channel pattern reflects the balance between the river's tendency to minimize distance and the constraints imposed by bank strength and sediment supply. The migration of meanders creates landscapes where the river's path is constantly changing, with erosion on one side balanced by deposition on the other, slowly moving the channel across its valley. The oxbow lakes formed when meanders cut off represent former channel locations, often retaining water long after abandonment and supporting ecosystems distinct from the active river. The sinuosity of rivers changes along their length, with headwater streams often being relatively straight, while lowland rivers become highly sinuous as gradient decreases. The engineered straightening of rivers reduces sinuosity, increasing velocity and erosive power, while decreasing habitat diversity and flood storage. The time for a river to return to its natural sinuosity after straightening varies from decades to centuries, with the rate depending on bank erodibility and the energy available to do geomorphic work. The measurement of sinuosity from maps reveals patterns related to geology, vegetation, and flow regime, with rivers in similar settings showing similar degrees of curvature. The aesthetic appeal of sinuous rivers, winding through valleys like ribbons draped across the land, speaks to something deep in human appreciation for natural patterns that reflect both order and variation. The slope of a river generally decreases from headwaters to mouth, creating a longitudinal profile that is steepest in mountains and flattest in lowlands. The concave profile shape emerges from the balance between erosion and deposition, with steep headwaters having high transport capacity relative to sediment supply, while lowland rivers receive more sediment than they can transport. The nick points or nick points in longitudinal profiles indicate locations where erosion is actively cutting upstream, often caused by base-level change, resistant rock layers, or human modifications. The energy available to a river depends on both gradient and discharge, with high-gradient streams having high energy per unit volume, while low-gradient rivers may have comparable total energy due to much larger volumes. The evolution of longitudinal profiles over geologic time involves upstream migration of erosion as rivers work to achieve equilibrium between their gradient and the sediment load they must transport. The human modification of river profiles through dams creates artificial base levels that cause upstream aggradation and downstream degradation, changing the natural profile that existed before impoundment. The profile of tributaries typically grades to the elevation of the main stem at their confluence, though waterfalls at tributary mouths indicate that equilibrium has not yet been achieved. The rate of profile adjustment varies with rock type and climate, with rivers in soft sediments adjusting within decades, while those in bedrock may take millions of years to respond to base-level changes. The profile of a river plotted on a graph shows a smooth curve in alluvial reaches, but a stepped appearance in bedrock with resistant layers, creating pauses in the otherwise continuous decline. The journey of water from mountain spring to ocean involves descending thousands or tens of thousands of feet, with the gradient determining how quickly that descent occurs and what type of channel forms at each elevation. The width of rivers increases downstream in rough proportion to the square root of discharge, creating predictable relationships that geomorphologists use to estimate flow from channel dimensions. The factors controlling width include bank erodibility, vegetation, sediment supply, and flood regime, with all of these interacting to determine the cross-sectional shape at any location. The width-to-depth ratio varies systematically with channel pattern, with braided rivers being wide and shallow, while meandering rivers are narrow and deep. The seasonal changes in wetted width follow discharge, with low flows retreating to narrow base flow channels, while floods spread across the entire active channel and beyond. The ecological consequences of width include influences on water temperature through shading, with narrow channels more easily shaded by riparian vegetation than wide channels. The measurement of width from aerial photographs or satellite imagery provides information about channel condition and can reveal changes over time caused by management actions or natural evolution. The human modification of river width through dredging and levee construction creates channels narrower than would naturally occur, increasing velocity and often causing downstream erosion. The restoration of natural width involves removing constraints and allowing the river to establish its own dimensions based on the water and sediment it carries. The width of the Nile, the Amazon, the Mississippi, the Yangtze represents the integration of their entire drainage area, each river achieving the size necessary to convey its flow within banks that balance erosion and deposition. The visual impact of river width creates much of the impression of river size, with wide rivers appearing mighty even when shallow, while narrow rivers appear intimate regardless of their depth. The depth of rivers varies from mere inches in riffles to tens of feet in pools, creating three-dimensional habitat structure that influences species distribution and abundance. The average depth of a river cross-section relates to discharge and sediment characteristics, with rivers carrying coarse sediment tending to be shallower than those transporting fine material. The deepest point in a cross-section, the thalweg, shifts position across the channel width in response to bars and meanders, creating a thread of maximum depth that fish often follow during migrations. The scour pools that form during floods can be remarkably deep, with erosion driven by concentrated flow, creating holes that persist through subsequent low-flow periods. The depth of water controls light penetration, temperature stratification, and pressure, with deeper sections developing conditions that differ fundamentally from shallow areas. The fish utilizing different depths include surface feeders, mid-water swimmers, and bottom dwellers, each adapted to the specific conditions of their preferred depth zone. The seasonal patterns in depth follow discharge, with the same location being a shallow riffle during summer low flow and a deep run during spring floods. The measurement of depth across a channel cross-section reveals the channel's shape and helps estimate discharge using the velocity area method. The maximum depths achieved during floods may be recorded by scour lines on banks or by the high water marks left by debris, providing evidence that persists long after flows recede. The perception of depth influences human interaction with rivers, with shallow, clear water appearing safe and inviting while deep, dark water often evokes caution or even fear. Despite containing the same water, separated only by a few feet of distance, the velocity distribution in a river cross-section is complex, with the fastest water typically found at or near the surface in the center of the channel where friction is minimized. The logarithmic velocity profile describes how velocity increases with distance from the bed, with water moving very slowly in the boundary layer and accelerating upward until reaching maximum velocity. The secondary circulation in bends creates helical flow patterns that modify the typical velocity distribution, with water diving toward the outer bank at the surface and flowing toward the inner bank near the bed. The dead zones behind obstacles and in bank indentations provide refuge from current, creating spaces where organisms can rest without fighting flow. The turbulence in rivers adds a chaotic component to velocity, with instantaneous measurements showing wild fluctuations around the mean value as eddies and vortices pass. The ecological implications of velocity distribution are profound, with organisms selecting specific positions in the water column or behind obstacles based on their ability to maintain position and their feeding strategies. The measurement of velocity requires careful site selection and technique, with single-point measurements being unrepresentative of the complex three-dimensional flow field. The acoustic Doppler current profiler has revolutionized velocity measurement, allowing detailed characterization of flow patterns across entire cross-sections in minutes. The visualization of velocity using dyes or neutrally buoyant particles reveals the hidden structure of flow, making visible the swirls and streams that exist within what appears to be uniform current. The energy of flowing water, the force that shapes channels and determines what can live where, is fundamentally a function of velocity, with even small increases in speed producing large increases in the power available to move sediment and carve stone. The dissolved solids in river water represent the chemical signature of the watershed, with concentrations ranging from less than 10 milligrams per liter in pristine mountain streams to thousands in arid region rivers, where evaporation concentrates minerals. The major ions contributing to dissolved solids include calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, bicarbonate, sulfate, and chloride, each derived from the weathering of specific rock types or from atmospheric inputs. The total dissolved solids influence water density, though the effect is small in freshwater systems, and affect the osmotic balance that organisms must maintain between their body fluids and the surrounding water. The seasonal patterns in dissolved solids typically show higher concentrations during baseflow when groundwater dominates, and lower concentrations during floods when dilution by surface runoff reduces mineral content. The salinity of rivers increases in arid regions where evaporation exceeds precipitation, with some rivers becoming so saline that only specialized species can survive in their waters. The weathering reactions that produce dissolved solids occur slowly, with the same water molecules potentially residing in aquifers for decades or centuries before entering streams and carrying the accumulated minerals downstream. The human impacts on dissolved solids include pollution from road salt, agricultural chemicals, and industrial discharges that can dramatically increase concentrations above natural levels. The ecological threshold, where dissolved solids begin to stress freshwater organisms, varies by species, with some being sensitive to even modest increases, while others tolerate brackish conditions. The measurement of specific conductance provides a quick estimate of dissolved solids, with conductivity increasing proportionally as ion concentrations rise. The journey of minerals from rock to ocean, dissolved in river water, and transported over distances that may span continents, represents one of the fundamental geochemical cycles that shapes our planet's chemistry over geological time. The meandering wavelength of rivers, the distance from one bend to the next, follows mathematical relationships with channel width that hold across rivers of vastly different sizes and in different climatic zones. The typical meander wavelength is approximately 10 to 14 times the channel width, a ratio that emerges from the physics of flow in curved channels and the balance between erosional and depositional forces. The amplitude of meanders, the distance from the center line to the apex of a bend, increases as meanders mature, with young meanders being gentle curves and old meanders approaching complete loops. The migration rate of meanders varies with bank erodibility and flow magnitude, with some rivers shifting their channels several feet per year, while others remain stable for decades. The cutoff of meanders occurs when erosion on two adjacent bends meets, allowing the river to shortcut the loop and creating an oxbow lake from the abandoned channel. The frequency of meander cutoffs depends on how tightly curved the meanders become, with some rivers cutting off before bends become extreme, while others form nearly complete circles before shortcutting. The sedimentary deposits created by migrating meanders include point bars on the inside of bends and cut banks on the outside, creating a characteristic pattern of cross-bedding, visible in ancient river deposits now preserved as rock. The vegetation patterns on floodplains reflect meander migration, with bands of different aged forests marking the path of the river through time. The human attempts to stabilize meandering rivers through bank hardening and channelization work against the river's natural tendency to curve often causing problems downstream as the river seeks to re-establish its natural form. The beauty of meanders viewed from above, creating patterns that look almost too perfect to be natural, demonstrates that even chaotic flowing water follows underlying physical laws that produce order and regularity. The bankful discharge is the flow that fills the channel to the top of its banks, occurring on average every 1 to 2 years, and representing the flow that does the most geomorphic work over time. The channel dimensions reflect an equilibrium with bankful flow, with the river achieving a size and shape that can convey this critical discharge without excessive erosion or deposition. The concept of effective discharge recognizes that the flow doing most sediment transport is not the largest flood, but rather a moderate flow that combines sufficient power with sufficient frequency. The recurrence interval of bankful discharge varies with climate and watershed characteristics, with flashy systems potentially reaching bankful several times per year, while stable systems may go several years between events. The identification of bankful stage in the field involves looking for indicators like the top of point bars, changes in vegetation, or the lower limit of permanent bank vegetation. The human modification of flow regimes can change bankful discharge, with dams reducing peak flows causing channels to shrink as they adjust to the new flow regime. The ecological functions of bankful flows include scouring algae and sediment, mobilizing organic matter, providing access to floodplain habitat, and creating the disturbances that maintain channel complexity. The predictability of bankful flows allows organisms to time life history events, with some fish spawning in response to flows of specific magnitude that signal optimal conditions. The restoration of natural flow regimes increasingly focuses on maintaining or restoring bankful flows, recognizing that channels need periodic flushing to maintain their form and function. The moment when a river reaches bankful, with water touching the very edge of its banks and poised to spill onto the floodplain, represents a threshold between contained and uncontained flow, between the river in its channel and the river reclaiming its valley. The floodplain is not separate from the river, but rather an integral part of the river system, the area that the river periodically occupies during high flows. The formation of floodplains involves both vertical accretion as floods deposit sediment, and lateral accretion as point bars build outward, creating surfaces at various elevations reflecting different flood frequencies. The soil on floodplains is typically fertile due to periodic deposition of nutrient-rich sediment, though flooding also creates challenges for plants through anoxic conditions and physical damage. The forest communities on floodplains often include species tolerant of flooding, with adaptations like adventitious roots, flexible stems, or deciduous habits that reduce flood damage. The animal communities using floodplains include both permanent residents and seasonal visitors, who exploit the resources that become available during and after floods. The connectivity between river and floodplain drives productivity, with fish moving onto floodplains during floods to feed and spawn, taking advantage of the temporary abundance of food and habitat. The human development on floodplains creates conflicts between natural river processes and human infrastructure, with structures built in flood-prone areas repeatedly damaged by floods that are entirely natural occurrences. The ecosystem services provided by floodplains include flood storage, nutrient cycling, groundwater recharge, and habitat provision, with economic values that often exceed the agricultural or development values that motivate floodplain conversion. The restoration of floodplain connectivity through levee removal or setback improves both ecological function and flood management, demonstrating that working with natural processes produces better outcomes than fighting against them. The landscape of a natural floodplain, with its patchwork of oxbow lakes, ridge and swale topography, and vegetation bands reflecting elevation and flood frequency, records the river's history and provides a window into its future movements. The riparian buffer is the vegetated area along river edges that provides critical functions for both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, while protecting water quality. The width of effective riparian buffers varies with river size and management goals, with narrow buffers of 30 to 50 feet, providing basic functions, while wider buffers of several hundred feet being necessary for wildlife habitat and complete nutrient removal. The vegetation structure in riparian buffers ideally includes multiple layers from ground cover to shrubs to trees, creating complexity that supports diverse animal communities and maximizes ecological functions. The roots of riparian plants stabilize banks and create complexity in soil structure that enhances infiltration and reduces surface runoff. The canopy shading from riparian trees reduces water temperature, with even narrow strips of trees significantly cooling streams that would otherwise warm to stressful levels. The nutrients filtering through riparian buffers undergo transformations, with nitrogen being taken up by plants or converted to gas through denitrification, reducing the amounts reaching streams. The organic matter from riparian areas, including leaves, wood, and insects, provides energy to aquatic ecosystems, with forested streams often depending more on terrestrial inputs than on aquatic photosynthesis. The wildlife using riparian buffers includes species that depend on the interface between aquatic and terrestrial environments, with some animals using both realms during different life stages or activities. The human removal of riparian vegetation for agriculture or development eliminates these functions, causing water quality degradation, temperature increases, and loss of aquatic habitat. The restoration of riparian buffers has become a priority in watershed management, with reforestation along degraded streams producing measurable improvements in water quality and biological condition within years of planting. The substrate composition of river bottoms determines which organisms can live there, with different species requiring different particle sizes for attachment, burrowing, or building. The classification of substrate includes bedrock, boulders, cobbles, gravel, sand, silt, and clay, each creating distinct habitat conditions. The stability of substrate particles depends on their size relative to flow velocity, with small particles being mobile during low flows, while large particles require floods to move. The embeddedness of substrate describes how much fine sediment fills the spaces between larger particles, with high embeddedness reducing habitat quality by eliminating the interstitial spaces where many invertebrates live. The organisms adapted to different substrates show remarkable specialization, with some species occurring only on bedrock, others only in gravel, and still others only in fine sediments. The seasonal changes in substrate can be dramatic in some rivers, with winter floods mobilizing the entire bed and redistributing particles, while summer low flows allow colonization and stabilization. The human impacts on substrate include increased fine sediment from erosion that embeds gravels, or conversely, the trapping of sediment behind dams that causes downstream armoring with coarse particle. The spawning requirements of fish often include specific substrate types, with salmon requiring clean gravel of particular sizes, where water flows through spaces, delivering oxygen to eggs. The measurement of substrate composition involves visual estimates or physical sampling, with protocols designed to characterize the particle size distribution and detect changes over time. The substrate forms the foundation of benthic habitat, the bottom world of rivers where much of the biological activity occurs and where the river's physical processes leave their most direct imprint. The algae, growing on river substrates, form the periphyton community that provides the base of the food web in many streams, converting sunlight and nutrients into organic matter that supports grazers and collectors. The types of algae vary with light, nutrients, current velocity, and substrate, with different communities developing in different conditions. The diatoms dominate many periphyton communities, their silica shells creating the slippery coating on rocks that makes wading treacherous, but indicates healthy ecosystem function. The filamentous algae can grow into long strands that wave in the current, creating structures that trap organic particles and provide habitat for invertebrates. The blooms of algae that occur in nutrient-rich conditions can cover the entire river bottom in thick mats that appear green or brown and may smell unpleasant as they decompose. The grazing pressure from invertebrates and fish controls algae abundance in many rivers. with removal of grazers causing algae to increase dramatically. The seasonal patterns in algae growth follow light and temperature, with peak growth typically in spring or early summer when light is abundant, but temperatures are still moderate. The human impacts on algae include nutrient pollution that stimulates excessive growth and sedimentation that buries periphyton communities beneath layers of fine particles. The productivity of periphyton can be remarkably high, with rates per unit area sometimes exceeding those of agricultural crops when conditions are optimal. The scraping of algae from rocks by aquatic insects, fish, and other grazers transfers energy from primary producers to higher trophic levels, making periphyton communities critical, even though they are often invisible to casual observers who see only the rocks they cover. The aquatic insects living in rivers have evolved extraordinary diversity, with mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, dragonflies, beetles, and true flies, each contributing numerous species adapted to specific conditions. The life cycles of aquatic insects typically include an aquatic larval stage that may last months to years, followed by emergence as flying adults that mate and lay eggs before dying within days or weeks. The feeding strategies include scrapers that graze algae, shredders that break down leaves and wood, collectors that filter or gather fine particles, and predators that hunt other invertebrates. The morphological adaptations to current include streamlined bodies, hooks and claws for attachment, and silk threads for anchoring to substrates. The respiratory adaptations range from gills that extract oxygen from water to air tubes that allow breathing at the surface to plastrons that hold thin films of air around the body. The indicator value of aquatic insects makes them useful for assessing water quality, with some groups being sensitive to pollution while others tolerate degraded conditions. The emergence of adult insects creates pulses of energy transfer from aquatic to terrestrial ecosystems, with birds, bats, and spiders feeding on the newly emerged adults. The diversity of aquatic insects in a river reflects habitat quality, with healthy streams supporting dozens or hundreds of species, while degraded streams may have only a few tolerant taxa. The observation of aquatic insects requires nets, close inspection, and often microscopes to identify species, but rewards patience with glimpses into a miniature world of remarkable complexity. The role of aquatic insects in river ecosystems extends far beyond their individual importance, as they process organic matter, cycle nutrients, serve as food for fish and wildlife, and indicate the overall health of the system. The fish communities in rivers are structured by flow, temperature, substrate, and food availability, with different species occupying distinct niches that allow coexistence. The headwater species often include small, cold water adapted fish like sculpin and darters that thrive in fast currents and clear water. The mid-reach species might include trout, bass, or pike depending on region, with these predators requiring deeper pools and abundant prey. The lowland species increasingly include warm water fish like catfish and carp that tolerate low oxygen and high temperatures that would stress upstream species. The migratory species like salmon and eels connect rivers to oceans, spending part of their lives in each environment and requiring unobstructed passage between them. The feeding strategies of fish range from insectivores that pick individual prey items to filter feeders that strain plankton to piscivores that hunt other fish. The reproductive strategies include nest builders that construct elaborate redds, broadcast spawners that release eggs into the current, and live bearers that give birth to developed young. The seasonal movements of fish follow temperature, flow, and breeding requirements, with some species moving long distances while others remain in small home ranges. The human impacts on fish communities include barriers like dams that block migration, pollution that degrades water quality, and overfishing that depletes populations. The conservation of native fish increasingly involves restoration of natural flow regimes, reconnection of fragmented habitat, and management of non-native species that compete with or prey on natives. The sight of fish holding in clear current or rising to take insects speaks to the health of river ecosystems, and the intricate relationships between water quality, habitat structure, and biological communities. The amphibians associated with rivers include frogs, toads, salamanders, and newts, many of which depend on both aquatic and terrestrial habitats during different life stages. The breeding of many amphibians occurs in quiet backwaters or floodplain pools, where eggs and larvae develop without being swept downstream by current. The larvae of stream-dwelling salamanders cling to rocks with flattened bodies and toe pads, resisting flow while feeding on aquatic invertebrates. The adults of some species remain in or near water throughout their lives, while others venture into forests, returning to streams only to breed. The sensitivity of amphibians to pollution makes them indicators of environmental quality, with declining populations often signaling problems that affect other species. The permeable skin of amphibians allows them to absorb oxygen and water directly, but also makes them vulnerable to contaminants dissolved in water or present on vegetation. The calls of frogs and toads fill spring nights along rivers, with males advertising their presence to females in choruses that can be heard for considerable distances. The predation pressure on amphibians includes fish, birds, mammals, and other amphibians, with eggs and larvae being particularly vulnerable. The habitat requirements of amphibians often include specific features like undercut banks, log jams, or spring seeps that provide refuges and breeding sites. The conservation challenges for riverine amphibians include habitat loss, pollution, disease, and climate change, with some species declining precipitously while others remain relatively stable. The connection between amphibians and rivers reminds us that ecosystem boundaries are porous, with animals moving between realms and depending on the health of both terrestrial and aquatic environments. The birds along rivers include species that feed on aquatic organisms, nest in riparian vegetation, or simply use rivers as travel corridors through otherwise unsuitable habitat. The kingfishers dive from perches to capture fish, their sharp vision allowing them to see through water surface reflections that would blind less adapted hunters. The herons and egrets wade in shallows, spearing fish and amphibians with quick strikes of their sharp bills. The dippers walk underwater in fast currents, searching for aquatic insects, while air trapped in their plumage provides buoyancy and insulation. The swallows and swifts feed on insects emerging from rivers, skimming low over water to catch their prey in acrobatic flight. The waterfowl, including ducks and geese, use rivers for feeding, resting, and nesting, with different species preferring different habitat conditions. The songbirds in riparian areas include warblers, vireos, and flycatchers that feed on insects and require the complex vegetation structure that healthy riparian zones provide. The migration routes of many birds follow river valleys, with rivers providing habitat, food, and navigational cues for travelers moving between breeding and wintering grounds. The nesting sites along rivers include cavities in old trees, platforms of sticks in live trees, and burrows excavated in soft banks. The conservation of riverbirds requires protecting both aquatic and riparian habitats, recognizing that degradation of either realm affects species that depend on both. The morning chorus along a river, with dozens of species contributing their voices to the symphony of sound mixing with the river's whisper, creates one of nature's most complex and beautiful soundscapes. The mammals visiting rivers include not just aquatic specialists like otters and beavers, but also terrestrial species that come to drink, hunt, or travel along the water's edge. The otters are superbly adapted to aquatic life, with streamlined bodies, webbed feet, and dense fur that traps air for insulation in cold water. The beavers modify rivers through dam building, creating ponds that alter flow regimes and sediment transport, while providing habitat for numerous other species. The muskrats and nutria are semi-aquatic rodents that feed on aquatic vegetation and create burrows in riverbanks. The raccoons, bears, and foxes hunt along rivers for fish, amphibians, and invertebrates, using the concentration of prey along water's edge. The deer, elk, and moose come to rivers to drink and to feed on riparian vegetation, their presence influencing plant communities through browsing. The bats that hunt over rivers feed on the abundant insects emerging from aquatic ecosystems, with some species specialized for capturing prey from water surfaces. The carnivores, including mountain lions, wolves, and coyotes, use rivers as travel routes and hunt the concentrations of prey animals that rivers attract. The tracks in sand and mud along rivers tell stories of the nocturnal visits of animals that humans rarely see, revealing the hidden activity that occurs when people are absent. The conservation of river corridors provides benefits for mammals that extend far beyond the riparian zone, with these linear habitats serving as connectors, allowing movement through fragmented landscapes. The sight of an otter sliding down a muddy bank or a deer drinking at dawn reminds us that rivers are magnets for life, drawing animals from the surrounding landscape to the abundance that water creates. The invertebrates beyond insects include crayfish, mussels, snails, worms, and numerous microscopic organisms, each playing specific roles in river ecosystem function. The crayfish are both predators and scavengers, consuming living and dead material while themselves providing food for fish and mammals. The freshwater mussels filter enormous volumes of water, removing particles and improving water clarity while providing hard surfaces that other organisms colonize. The snails graze on algae and are themselves food for fish and birds, with some species being intermediate hosts for parasites that require multiple hosts to complete their life cycles. The aquatic worms, including oligochaetes, live in sediments, consuming organic matter and serving as indicators of pollution, with different species tolerating different oxygen levels. The microscopic invertebrates include protozoans, rotifers, and copepods that feed on bacteria and algae while providing food for larger organisms. The ecological roles of invertebrates include breaking down organic matter, cycling nutrients, filtering water, and providing food for higher trophic levels. The diversity of invertebrates in healthy rivers can be staggering, with hundreds of species coexisting in complex food webs where each organism occupies a specific niche. The human impacts on invertebrates include pollution that eliminates sensitive species, sedimentation that buries habitat, and flow alteration that disrupts life cycles timed to natural patterns. The study of invertebrate communities provides detailed information about river health, with changes in diversity and composition indicating problems before they become obvious through other measures. The hidden world of river invertebrates, visible only through careful collection and examination, reveals complexity and beauty that rivals that of any ecosystem on Earth. The bacteria and other microorganisms in rivers are invisible to the naked eye, but outnumber all other organisms and perform critical functions in decomposition and nutrient cycling. The decomposition of organic matter depends on bacteria and fungi that break down complex molecules, releasing nutrients that become available to other organisms. The bacterial communities on submerged surfaces form biofilms, slimy coatings that protect bacteria, while providing habitat for protozoans and other microscopic organisms. The nitrogen cycle in rivers involves multiple bacterial processes, including nitrification that converts ammonia to nitrate, and denitrification that converts nitrate to nitrogen gas. The sulfur and iron cycles also involve bacterial transformations, with different species specialized for specific chemical reactions. The pathogenic bacteria in rivers include those from human and animal waste, with monitoring programs tracking indicator bacteria to assess health risks. The diversity of bacteria in rivers includes thousands of species, most unknown to science and performing functions we barely understand. The energy flow through river ecosystems depends fundamentally on microbial processes, with bacteria and fungi making nutrients available that would otherwise remain locked in dead organic matter. The human impacts on microbial communities include antibiotics and other chemicals that enter rivers and may select for resistant strains. The study of river microorganisms increasingly uses molecular techniques that identify bacteria based on their DNA, revealing diversity that traditional culturing methods missed. The microbial world, beneath the visible surface of river life, drives processes essential to ecosystem function, working constantly and invisibly to cycle nutrients, decompose organic matter, and support the food webs that we can see. The pollution of rivers represents one of humanity's greatest environmental challenges, with contaminants ranging from sewage to industrial chemicals to agricultural runoff degrading water quality worldwide. The point sources of pollution, including wastewater treatment plants and industrial facilities, discharge at specific locations, making them relatively easier to regulate and control than non-point sources. The non-point pollution from diffuse sources like agricultural fields and urban areas is much harder to manage, as it enters rivers through countless pathways across entire watersheds. The nutrients from fertilizers and sewage cause eutrophication, with excessive algae growth leading to oxygen depletion and fish kills. The sediment from erosion is among the most common pollutants by volume, smothering habitat and carrying attached chemicals downstream. The toxic chemicals, including pesticides, heavy metals, and industrial compounds, can poison aquatic life even at low concentrations, with some substances accumulating in food webs to reach dangerous levels. The thermal pollution from power plants and other industrial cooling raises water temperatures beyond what many species can tolerate. The pharmaceutical compounds from human waste are increasingly recognized as concerning pollutants, with effects on aquatic organisms that are just beginning to be understood. The plastic pollution in rivers includes both visible debris and microplastics too small to see, with particles entering food webs and potentially affecting organisms throughout the system. The solution to river pollution requires actions across entire watersheds, combining better treatment of point sources with land use changes that reduce non-point inputs, a challenge that requires cooperation and resources, but that is essential for river health. The restoration of degraded rivers seeks to return natural structure and function, improving habitat quality and ecological services while respecting human needs and constraints. The techniques used in restoration include removing barriers to allow fish passage, adding large wood to create habitat complexity, reconnecting rivers to floodplains, and replanting riparian vegetation. The goals of restoration vary with context, but generally include improving water quality, increasing biodiversity, enhancing flood resilience, and restoring natural flow regimes. The challenges in restoration include limited budgets, conflicting human uses, incomplete understanding of ecosystem dynamics, and the time required for recovery. The success of restoration varies widely, with some projects producing dramatic improvements within years, while others show little benefit even after decades. The monitoring of restoration projects provides essential feedback, revealing what works and what doesn't, while documenting changes in physical, chemical, and biological conditions. The involvement of local communities in restoration increases success by building support and incorporating local knowledge while providing educational opportunities. The dam removal has emerged as a powerful restoration tool, with the removal of obsolete dams allowing rivers to restore natural flow and sediment regimes. The assisted recovery through active management may be necessary in highly degraded systems, with human intervention helping ecosystems move toward desired conditions. The long-term commitment required for river restoration extends beyond initial construction to include adaptive management and maintenance as understanding improves. The vision of restoration is not to return rivers to some imagined pristine state, but rather to guide them toward conditions that support diverse native communities and sustainable human uses, recognizing that rivers in modern landscapes must balance ecological and social needs. The cultural significance of rivers extends across human history, with civilizations rising along rivers that provided water, food, transportation, and waste disposal. The spiritual importance of rivers appears in religions worldwide, with rivers considered sacred in many traditions, and serving as sites for ritual bathing and ceremony. The economic value of rivers includes water supply for agriculture and industry, hydropower generation, transportation of goods, and recreation that supports tourism. The aesthetic appreciation of rivers inspires art, literature, and music, with flowing water representing life, time, change, and connection across cultures. The conflicts over rivers increasingly involve competing demands for water, with agriculture, cities, industry, and ecosystems all requiring flows that may exceed supply. The governance of rivers involves international treaties, national laws, and local regulations, with the challenge of managing resources that flow across political boundaries. The indigenous peoples along rivers often maintain traditional relationships with water, with practices and knowledge developed over millennia, providing insights for sustainable management. The urban rivers flowing through cities face unique challenges and opportunities, with restoration projects increasingly recognizing that rivers in cities can provide ecological and social benefits. The future of rivers depends on decisions being made now about climate change, land use, water allocation, and conservation priorities. The connection between human well-being and river health is fundamental, with degraded rivers ultimately affecting human communities through reduced water quality, increased flooding, and loss of the services that rivers provide. The rivers that remain relatively wild remind us of what has been lost elsewhere, while showing what restoration might achieve, given sufficient commitment and resources. The future of rivers in a changing climate includes altered precipitation patterns, changed timing of snowmelt, increased frequency of extreme floods and droughts, and rising temperatures that stress aquatic life. The predictions vary by region but generally include more variable flows, with extremes in both directions becoming more common than historical averages. The warming water temperatures will shift species distributions, with cold water fish moving upstream or disappearing from rivers that become too warm. The earlier snowmelt predicted for many regions will shift the timing of peak flows, potentially creating mismatches between flow patterns and the life cycles of organisms adapted to historical patterns. The increased drought frequency and severity will test the resilience of river ecosystems, with some species potentially extirpated from reaches that become too dry. The changed precipitation intensity will alter erosion and sediment transport, potentially increasing sedimentation during intense storms while reducing transport during droughts. The adaptation strategies for rivers include protecting refugia, where conditions may remain suitable, maintaining connectivity to allow species movements, and managing human water use to ensure environmental flows. The resilience of rivers depends on maintaining the natural variability and complexity that allows ecosystems to absorb disturbances and recover from shocks. The monitoring of rivers will become increasingly important for detecting changes and informing management responses as conditions shift. The uncertainty about specific future conditions argues for flexible management approaches that can adapt as understanding improves rather than rigid plans based on assumptions that may prove incorrect. The rivers of tomorrow will differ from those of today, shaped by climates, unlike those that formed the ecosystems we now see, requiring wisdom and humility as we navigate an uncertain future. The interconnection of rivers with the landscapes through which they flow creates systems where changes anywhere in the watershed potentially affect the river, and where river changes influence the surrounding land. The hydrologic cycle that moves water from ocean to atmosphere, to land, to rivers, to ocean, connects all water on Earth in a single system, operating across scales from molecular to global. The nutrient cycling that occurs in rivers involves transformations between dissolved and particulate forms, between organic and inorganic compounds, and between available and unavailable states. The energy flowing through river ecosystems comes from sunlight, captured by plants and algae, and from organic matter falling into streams from surrounding landscapes. The information encoded in river form reveals the history of flow, sediment, and biological processes, with channel morphology recording the forces that shaped it. The services that rivers provide include water supply, waste assimilation, transportation, recreation, and habitat provision, with economic values that often remain unrecognized until degradation reduces them. The resilience of river ecosystems depends on maintaining the physical complexity, hydrologic variability, and biological diversity that allow recovery from disturbances. The sustainability of human use requires balancing extraction and alteration with the need to maintain ecosystem function and the services it provides. The beauty of rivers exists not just in their appearance, but in the relationships they embody, the connections they create, and the life they support. The mystery of rivers persists despite extensive study, with each answer raising new questions and each river teaching lessons that may not apply elsewhere. The movement of water from mountain to sea, from snowflake to raindrop to river to ocean, creates the pathways that connect landscapes, transport materials, and support life. The patience of water wearing away stone reminds us that even the gentlest persistence can reshape the world given sufficient time. The rhythm of rivers, pulsing with seasons and storms, provides a temporal structure to ecosystems and to human experience. The voice of rivers, speaking in the language of flowing water, has accompanied human existence since our species emerged and will continue long after we are gone. The rivers that remain relatively natural are treasures worth protecting, providing baselines for understanding how these systems function and what restoration might achieve elsewhere. The degraded rivers remind us of the consequences of treating water as merely a resource rather than as a living system deserving of respect and care. The restored rivers demonstrate that recovery is possible, that human actions can heal as well as harm, and that the investment in restoration yields returns, measured not just in economics, but in beauty, diversity, and resilience. The rivers flowing through darkness and light, through forests and cities, through the landscape of our world, connect us to something larger than ourselves, to cycles that predate humanity and will persist beyond us. The sound of flowing water, the sight of current moving over stones, the feel of cool water against skin, these experiences connect us directly to one of Earth's most fundamental processes. The river's journey from spring to sea, carrying water and sediment and life, mirroring in its path the journey each of us takes through time, provides metaphors that resonate across cultures and speak to something essential in the human experience. And now the rivers fade behind your thoughts. We've drifted through 100 quiet truths about these ancient waterways, from the spring emerging from stone to the delta spreading into the sea, from the tumbling mountain brook to the wide meandering lowland river. You are connected to this world. The water flowing through rivers is the same water that flows through you, cycling endlessly between earth and sky and sea. The minerals dissolved in river water echo the minerals in your bones and blood. The rhythm of rivers, their seasonal rise and fall, mirrors rhythms in your own body and life. Tonight, as you rest, rivers continue their patient journey to the sea. Water flowing over stones, carrying leaves and light, shaping landscapes grain by grain, moment by moment, with a persistence that measures time not in minutes, but in millennia. The spring keeps rising. The current keeps moving. The rivers keep flowing through darkness and dawn, through seasons and centuries, carving their patient paths through stone and soil. And you are safe, warm, resting in a world full of wonder, where water writes its story across the face of the earth, where every river is a thread connecting mountain to ocean, past to future, where the ancient song of flowing water continues its endless melody. If you're still awake, go ahead and watch the next chapter. Sleep well and dream softly. Good night.